We could ask the members to take their seats, members of the public as well. Good afternoon. This is the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals. We are scheduled for 2 to 5 today. And let me begin by asking each of the committee members to be recognized. As I say, I'm Joe Simidian, Chair of the Select Committee. We have with us as well Ann Wingert from Portola Valley. Thank you, Council Member. And we have Mary Lind Bernal from Saratoga. And we have Gary Waldeck, who is here from Los Altos Hills. And we have Donna Lind sitting in for Bruce McPherson. Ms. Lind is the alternate for Mr. McPherson and is the mayor of Scotts Valley. We have John Leopold, who is to my right, your left. And if you'd raise your hand, Mr. Leopold, so everybody can see, one of the vice chairs, in this case from Santa Cruz County. I saw Don Lane from Santa Cruz, thank you. Ed Bothorf from the city of Capitola, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And we have Jeff G. to my left, your right, who is sitting in as the alternate for Supervisor Dave Pine. Mark Adiego is with us as well, council member for South San Francisco. And I think Larry Moody has joined us, thank you, council member from the city of East Palo Alto. And the one member we are missing, I believe, at this point is Sam Hindi. He's in the parking lot. Who's looking for parking. All right, just so you know. And then among our alternates, I see Elizabeth Lewis, Jean Mardeau. I also see George Purnell. And we have other alternates who are here. Where is Council Member Otaki? Right there in the front row. Thank you very much. Any other alternates who are here who should be recognized, just so we have the who's who squared away? All right. If not, thank you very much. We obviously have full complement. And thank you again to everybody for making efforts, and when you can't be here, making sure that your alternate is here, if at all possible. Before we get to the tentative agenda that should be at your places, one of the things we talked about at the last meeting, just organizationally, was trying to come up with some meeting dates for the next few months. At your places, you should see the meeting schedule that we have come up with, which, as directed, has 2 meetings a month in August, September, October, 1 in November. They are Thursday afternoons, which was the direction of the committee. They are from 1 till 4, as you'll note at the top of the page, which was also the direction of the committee. Let me just say right now, as we welcome Vice Mayor Greg Scharf from Palo Alto, who's here in his role as an alternate, that there are no perfect schedules, there are no perfect dates, but this at least fit the requirement of having a chambers. Thank you again to the city of Palo Alto where we could hold these meetings. The expectation is they'll be here. Making sure that we had 2 meetings a month, making sure that there was at least a couple of weeks between each meeting to get some work done. And we ended up, as I say, with this schedule. So if it doesn't work for you, apologies. Please ask your alternate at the earliest opportunity. Wanted to make sure that members could plan ahead. Also wanted to make sure that members of the public who were interested could plan ahead as well. We do still plan to get these hearings. One of the other things that we've got is the benefit of taping, and let me just confirm with City of Palo Alto staff, Cash, if I can, we are taping again today, and those tapes will be available ultimately on Congresswoman Anna Eshu's website and/or other members of Congress if they choose to post. I don't think we've yet gotten the last meeting up yet, Ms. Zanardi, is that right? But coming soon. I want to say early, or it is. You think the video is up? All right, going even more efficiently than I thought. So, meeting schedule is here. Also at your place, colleagues, some of you will have seen this electronically, but the city of Palo Alto has produced a letter dated July 7th, sharing its point of view on the issues that are before us. Wanted to make sure everybody had that, so it is at your places if you haven't had a chance to download or take a look. And we'll say thank you to Mr. Hindi for joining us. So we are now a full complement of 12. And I think from a logistics standpoint, that's pretty much it. Before we dive right into the agenda for today, let me just offer a couple of notes. You'll see footnotes 1 and 2. The first footnote refers to the fact that we are hoping, now that the procedural issues are all squared away, to wade right back into 1AI, which is the SFO Class B amendment today, which we had some discussion on at the last meeting. Then, as to the next item, which is a significant item, obviously, the surfer Big Sur conversation, the FAA has asked if we could continue that to our next meeting in August, just because they'd like a little more time to pull some information together. I was pretty sure that the group would want a fully informed FAA response, and so I made the executive decision to say, yes, if you need to wait until August, let's wait until August. Better to have a full conversation than one that is a little bit short. So we're expecting that conversation at our next meeting. Going to try today to do not only AI, meaning the Class B amendment, but then III, IV, and V. These are under 1A. And then, time permitting, and we'll see how fast and how far we go, under 1B, the issue of other solutions as identified by the committee. Wanted to sort of brainstorm a little of those, and I want to emphasize brainstorm. Toss them out, get them on the list, not try and discuss them at any length today, but just make sure we've surfaced them for the FAA so that they can start digging into them and responding at subsequent meetings. So that is the tentative agenda. Any concerns, questions, suggestions? Somebody wants to make sure something didn't get left out that hasn't been mentioned, or shall we just pick up where we left off? Ready to go? Okay. And as we've mentioned previously for members of the public, at these working committee meetings, we are not taking public testimony, again, having done that at the 3 public hearings. But when we come up with a document which we expect reflects the tentative recommendations of the committee, there certainly will be an opportunity for public comment on that document before this body takes any formal action. Just want to emphasize that at each meeting. All right. Back to the FAA. Glenn Martin is not with us today. Steve May is with us today. So, Mr. May, I'm sure everybody wants to know whether or not we're going to get the same answers from you that we did from Mr. Martin. So that'll make it an interesting conversation. Where would you like to pick up in terms of the last conversation? And obviously, colleagues, this is a chance to follow up. We were sort of in the middle of this conversation when last we met. We had the presentation on the overhead. And let me just ask the staff here, Mr. Ali, if is there something we should do to get our screens up, or is that something we can? All right, thank you again. Mr. May, welcome, and what would you like, where would you like to begin today?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, for allowing us to come and present more information to the committee. We're going to start off on the Class B amendment. We have a couple more slides just to provide a little bit more information to the committee. And then we'll proceed into the night information and then on to the candles. I'll pause between each one of those to allow comments. But of course, as I'm going through any of the slides, if anybody has questions or would like to raise a comment, please do so as I'm going through those. So if you can, Steve, if you can go ahead and advance that. So like I said, the first one's going to be the San Francisco Class B amendment. I just want to mention a couple things before I get started here. Generally, the Class B airspace is designed for a higher level of safety for aircraft, and that's the whole reason why you have Class B airspace around airports. You'll see higher performing aircraft in the Class B airspace. Some of the lower performing aircraft, GA aircraft, know that exists, and they are going to be very careful or try to avoid that as they're going through that depending on their speed. So it's very similar to a smaller, maybe a moped going on a freeway. I mean, that's just, you get into situations where speed's just not going to be an advantage to either one of those. So again, that's the purpose of the Class B containment, is to contain those higher performing aircraft as they're coming into the airport and descending down into that airspace. The chart that I have up here is what we looked at last week, so I just want to touch on a couple more things before we move on. The white line is the profile of the surfer, and the surfer was designed as an optimum profile descent. And that was the purpose of that. It was not designed to stay contained within the Class B airspace. So we designed it because we wanted the optimum profile descent, knowing that there were a couple points on there that fall outside of that Class B airspace. We had a proposal at that point to come back around after that was implemented and look at making modifications to the Class B so that we have that containment. okay? So this is the intended design. Again, this is the profile. The yellow lines are the different layers of the Class B airspace. The very top one is the outside concentric circle. I'll have a diagram up here where we'll be able to match those up. Also on this slide here, you can see the reference waypoints on the surfer. So you have Menlo off to the left, and then Swells, Eddy, and then Epic off to the right. So just for a geographical reference point, the Epic is pretty near the coastline. So that's about where the aircraft are crossing the coastline as they're coming across the Bay Area there, Monterey Bay. Okay, next slide. This is also background information. This is the actual approach plate for the surfer. So on this here, you can see all the waypoints. This is not to scale, just so you know. It's primarily a graphic to indicate the waypoints and any of the directions in between those. If you can kind of just start off down on the bottom there and follow along with me right on that waves waypoint. I'll highlight a couple points around that. Off to the left, you see a couple of numbers, the FL 190 and the 15,000. All right, so that's altitude, and that means that the aircraft are to stay between flight level 190 and 15,000 feet. So that's how you read that. Right next to that, off to the right, is the 280K, so that's 280 knots. That's the speed for the aircraft. So if you follow each one of those waypoints, you'll see similar notations if they do have altitude and speed restrictions. You also see right around the waves that little loop that goes around. That's a design holding pattern, so you got one at waves and one at Epic. We did a look at Epic, and it's used very, very little. It's not used very much at all, but it's designed into the procedure for the controllers if they need to use that. Moving on to the next slide. So now we're looking down onto the procedure. The magenta lines are the Class B airspace. The yellow line is the surfer procedure. Starting in there at the airport up on the top left, that section of Class B goes from the surface all the way up to 10,000 feet. I'm sorry. Yeah, up to 10,000 feet. Okay, so that whole airspace is all Class B. The next level out, right in that area, is going to be 4 to 10,000 feet. And then the next one out is 6 to 10,000, and then that next one out is 8 to 10,000. So when you're looking at the profile, that's how you kind of get that upside down wedding cake is what we refer to it as. So this is just looking down on it. Again, you get some reference points on the waypoints, the Epic, Eddy, and Swells, and the Menlo. Okay, moving on. This slide here just introduces the BRICS star, so you can see where that purple line is that comes in from the north, down, and right about that last layer of the Class B is where the BRICS goes right underneath the surfer. Okay, so the BRICS is at about 7,000 feet, right at about that point. And the next slide. So now we want to start looking at reasons for aircraft leveling off. That's really one of the topics that we talked about last week and in association with the Class B. This is again looking at the surfer from a profile. I guess purple and magenta, it looks like to me off to the left is the profile of the Class B airspace. So you can see those layers. You have from the left to right, I'm going to start with the Swells waypoint. So that's just a reference of where that crosses that procedure. Then you have the Eddy waypoint. The next one is the blue line. That's about where the BRICS goes underneath the surfer. And then off to the right is the yellow line. That's about where the coastline is. And then the last one there, Epic, is the waypoint Epic. And the next slide. So this slide here, these are the same exact flight tracks. What the blue is doing here is highlighting when the aircraft is leveling off. So you can see the leveling off occurs out closer to the coastline before the Class B. There's some leveling off there. That's at about 10,000 feet. The next one down is at 8,000 feet. There's some more leveling off there. And the next one down should be about 6,000 feet. So you're getting some leveling off at each one of those points there as it goes across that Class B. So a couple other things I want to mention on the Class B is while we have these proposals in place to make changes to the Class B airspace, and that's something that we're actively working on. While we are adding some airspace to the Class B to cover those areas where that surfer falls out, there may be other areas of the Class B where we're giving airspace back to some of the other airspaces. So it's not, just so you know, it's not just absorbing a whole bunch of additional airspace. There is other areas where we're giving some of that back. As far as scheduling for that, we're about 6 months into a 18 to 24 month schedule for a Class B implementation. So we're well into that. Currently, we're in the planning phase of scheduling public informational meetings. So that's going to be coming up here pretty soon. Once we get some dates and everything, we'll go out publicly with those. And then that actually does go through rulemaking. And any process that goes through rulemaking also has a public comment period associated with it. So even after we do this informational briefing and we get comments back and go forward with the design, there's a formal process for rulemaking for public input. That concludes what I had to say on the Class B. Are there any questions before we move on?
Councilmember Bernal to be followed by Councilmember Lane.
I'd like to know what the public input looks like for the process that you just spoke about, since we have just finished our public outreach. What venues are going to be available for the public to comment? Okay,
so the informational workshops so the FAA will actually come out. There'll be some locations around locally here, anywhere that seems appropriate to get public input for the Class B. So they may, that Class B is pretty large. There may be other areas over in the Oakland side so we'd go out publicly for those. So we'd be providing information at those workshops. Any comments that we get back from the public during that period, we'll take into account in that proposal.
And noticing for these workshops will occur how?
Can you repeat that?
How will the noticing occur for the public?
So we do noticing through social media. We do it in the Federal Register and local newspapers. We'll let the public know about those meetings.
And social media, Facebook, Nextdoor?
Primarily Twitter. We have a Twitter account where we do a lot of notification through Twitter.
Let me interrupt for just a moment, if I may. Mr. May,
yes.
I was going to say I don't want to put you on the spot, but actually I do want to put you on the spot.
That's
so
okay.
When the time comes for those workshops, could we ask that you get directly in touch with the affected cities if you don't already? You may already do that, but if you could commit to doing that in some formal way, so the cities in the 3 counties that we're talking about, and just let them know. And then based on this experience, I think it's a pretty good bet that all close to 40 cities would be happy to help you spread the word about the workshops and the hearings. Okay? No, I'm quite serious.
Absolutely.
I think if you let each of the communities know, then each of them will put the word out, and then people really will know. And I think that can be a force multiplier that helps you. And Councilmember Bernal, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was hoping we could get a little bit more, and so I'm going to look to my staff and ask that we follow up with Mr. May and the FAA about how they might do that, but I think it would be a good ancillary outcome of this conversation. All good here. Let me go to Mr. Lane next, then to Ms. Weingart next, and then to Mr. Waldeck next.
Yeah, could I ask you to go back to the...
Colleagues, could you pull the microphones a little bit closer? They do move. They will come.
Could I ask you to go back to the very first slide we saw today that showed the... Right, well, that'll do for, there's a couple that have the same image. I'm just trying to understand something you said that surprised me just because I'm a novice at this. You were saying that this is the design, so it's designed that the descent would not always be in the Class B airspace. That was intentional. Is that what you said?
Well, the design for the surfer procedure was for an optimum profile descent. The consequence of that was there's a couple areas that came outside of Class B.
Okay.
Okay, so if I said that, let me rephrase that.
Yeah,
We didn't
that
go
makes
into it and say, you know what, let's design a procedure that doesn't go in Class B. All right, we designed a procedure to try and get an optimum profile descent. That's what we were shooting for. The consequence was there's a couple areas that fall outside of the Class B.
Right.
I think
So
that-
then, but the other part, so that now I understand that part. Then the other half of that is, when you showed the leveling off, are planes, are aircraft doing that to get back into Class B space, or are they doing it for other reasons?
So there's several different reasons. Class B is one of the reasons for the aircraft leveling off. So what I want to leave everybody with here is, assuming we move forward with the Class B modifications and we're able to fully contain that surfer procedure, that doesn't necessarily mean that surfer procedure will never have leveling off again, okay? So the Class B is one reason why the aircraft level off for that surfer. Other reasons are, if you remember back to the scope video that we showed last time, and we were showing that surfer procedure and other aircraft coming down the bodega, and then they have to kind of go out a little bit, so you have this sequencing and separation. That's another reason that the aircraft are going to be leveling off in that area. All right. The bricks procedure goes right underneath that. That might be another reason for that particular surfer procedure to be leveling off. So there are a number of reasons for the level off on that surfer. Class B is one of them.
Okay, that's important, because I kind of had this impression that if you made the adjustment, that all of it was related to Class B.
Yeah.
And so some of the problems will persist of the noise associated with leveling off, even if this optimal descent is all contained within Class B.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Weingart?
Thank you. Mr. May, just if you could amplify a little bit more for us on your comment about your 6 months into, I think you said an 18-month review period for the potential changes to the Class B space. Can you give us an idea of what you're looking at in terms of what those changes potentially are? You've referred to some portion of it, obviously, as you were just answering Mr. Lane's question, but I know that there are other objectives, I think, related to what you're trying to accomplish, and it'd be, I think, very useful for us to understand exactly what types of procedural changes you're considering.
Okay, so for the Class B, actually following any of our Metroplex redesigns, Northern California being one of them, we have a Class B team come right in after that and look for opportunities for better containment of the Class B. Right, so there may be other areas, other procedures that are very similar to this that we may be looking at. I don't have a list of those for you here tonight, and we probably aren't prepared to publicly release anything until we hold these informational meetings. So at that time there, we would have more information to talk about exactly what those changes are going to be. And that's the purpose of those meetings.
We're going to go to Mr. Waldeck next, and then to Mr. Leopold.
We'll see if I can be heard tonight. Mr. May, thank you for coming. A couple of questions dealing with this topic. It's my understanding, according to several research papers I've seen out of Stanford, at least 5, the definition of an OPD approach is actually usually higher than what we're seeing here. And so the first question I have relating to that is, why are we trying to push the altitudes lower? I don't understand that, to get an OPD approach. Can you explain that?
I don't have an answer to that.
If we supply you the papers, can you respond to us later on?
Yeah, to me, that's a discussion that we could cover when we're talking about the Big Sur and the Surfer. I mean, that's really when we're going to be looking at that, on that OPD, on whether we're going to be able to do that on the Big Sur flight track.
Okay.
So
Yeah, my
if you're okay
question
with
is, why
that.
is this particular approach supposedly OPD, but yet it's generally lower than other OPD approaches? We didn't understand the
Yeah,
rationale for it.
without looking at data, I can't confirm that it's lower than other OPDs.
Okay. I'll accept
I mean,
that for
another
now.
thing you got to consider is it's really dependent on the fleet mix too. I mean, these are designed around the primary fleet mix using these.
I do understand.
Okay, so
Yeah,
I mean,
they all have slightly different descent angles.
they're all
I-
slightly different.
Yeah.
And that's why you have those windows of those altitudes on that OPD that go from, 10 to 15. I mean, that's a pretty wide altitude there to allow those different aircraft to come in on an OPD.
I concur.
Okay.
Okay, so the next phase of the question, I posed this question last time we met, but I'm going to ask it again. We're trying to get to Point Menlo as your turn point to turn final into San Francisco. And so can we put up the next chart, please, the next one in sequence, sir, Mr. Carnes? It's the other one showing the actual map of the bay. No, keep going back. You're going too far. Back up. Back. There was one in here that showed the overall Google Earth view.
Okay, go one more, Steve. One more. I think that's the one you're talking about.
This could be it.
There's Menlo there.
Yeah, okay. So if you take a look at where Point Menlo is, if you take, and just after that, it makes a left turn and goes and lines up with runway 28. So my question is, if instead you went to Menlo, let me back up. If we added a little distance in that glide path, then you could in fact raise that altitude out here at Point Epic, at the point of entry. So you could fly to, say, for example, Rockme, which is about 2 miles to the southeast there, at 1,000 feet or more higher. It would give you the additional distance to lose that extra altitude, but it would reduce the overall height impact and noise impact on the ground as you're flying into that point. This is a significant part of the program that we're talking about. The altitudes that have been picked here were, looks like, minimized as opposed to standard. And now we pick a point here where you're at 4,000 feet over Menlo, when in fact you could still be 4,000 feet over Menlo if you came in at 5,000 over Rockme, which is just a little bit to the right of where that big turn is. And so my question is, was any thought like that given, and if not, can it be, to help improve the overall noise performance in effect on the ground?
So you mentioned that last
I did.
meeting, and you certainly got me thinking about it, so I went back to look at where Rockme is. It's actually on the ILS approach coming right into San Francisco.
Why I recommended it.
Yeah, so it's
Excuse me, Mr.
straight-
May, just, so, for everyone in the room, Rockme is
Rockme is a waypoint.
and a waypoint is
Or a fix. It's actually a fix on, it's a point, it's very similar to the Epic, the Eddy, the Swells. These are points on a procedure.
which is a flight path.
Which is
So, so a point on a procedure is a place in the sky, yes, to
Yes.
use the simplest of terms?
Very-
Got
yeah.
it, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, and then you talked about ILS, and again, for everybody in the room, which
So
stands for?
ILS is the Instrument Landing System, and there's a procedure published for flying that ILS approach coming into San Francisco.
Okay, so when the conversation is about Rockme, you're talking about a place in the sky on a flight path into SFO. Is that a fair summary?
Exact. It's very similar to Menlo.
Great.
Menlo follows that.
In fact, it's on that same path.
It's a little bit off to the right and
Little off to
out
the right.
over the bay. So I looked at it. That would basically move that track to the right about 2 miles, and it's starting to get very close to the San Jose Class C airspace. So anyways, I just wanted to let you know, I went back and looked at it because I hadn't heard of Rockme before, and I wanted to know where that was. This is something that we're going to cover in our Surfer, Big Sur, Menlo discussions. I mean, it's...
All right, so we'll revisit this.
Yeah, this is going to be...
Yeah, the whole idea here is just to increase that overall glide distance so you can in fact raise the altitude. That's the fundamental premise here. And so if you can find a way to increase that, that would be it. That concludes my questions for now.
Thank you, Mr. Waldeck. Mr. Leopold.
Thank you. Mr. May, I was wondering if you have an idea now that we're over a year into this new flight path, how many violation of the Class B airspace we see on a regular basis or monthly or annually or anything?
0 violations as far as I'm concerned. We don't call them violations.
Well, I mean, planes outside the airspace, because you show, for instance, that at the Epic waypoint, planes are supposed to be between 10 and 15. And I get regular reports and I've seen the data that shows that they're under 10,000. And we also hear generally in the mountains that these planes are much lower than the Class B airspace. So I'm just trying to get some sense as to what that issue looks like from the FAA and how big of a problem that is.
Steve, can you go to the profile with the orange? Thank you. So if you look at that, there is an area there right about where the blue line is on the surfer bricks, right in there. See that?
Yeah.
So that's an area there where the aircraft are coming out of the Class B airspace. All right, that's not a violation. There's procedures that we use to administer that, so it's not a violation. But I mean, that kind of gives you an example of, if your question is how often, then I don't know what the number is, but if you just look at that, you can see there are aircraft that are falling into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's confusing to me that a route was designed that would take it outside the Class B airspace, and at least 2 out of the 3 reasons you mentioned why something might come out seem directly related to the issues of new path, new jet path, whether it be surfer or bricks. And so the complaints we're getting, which are extraordinary, seem to be related to these changes. And now that we're talking about a process that you're thinking about changing the Class B airspace, and you say we're 6 months into an 18 or 24-month process, I think one of the questions that Councilmember Lane and I were talking about just on the car ride over is trying to figure out what people's expectations should be of what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. Because if that Class B airspace change takes place, which I'm imagining, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, will help with an OPD that will hopefully be quieter. And if we're looking at that a year and a half to 2 years away, that's not great for anybody who's suffering under the current airspace. And if we suggest changes to the Surfer, Big Sur, or any of these other changes, and I'm not any changes, what is the expectation that the public should have about the difference it's going to make with the problems they're having right now? I mean, are we telling people that any of our recommendations here, are we really talking about relief in a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years?
Just a second, if I may. Excuse us, we're sharing microphones here. Mr. May, to just tease that out a little bit more. I think the answer at one level is some things we can do sooner, some things we can only do later. So if that's the answer, I think saying that out loud would be helpful. But then to try and respond a little more fully to Mr. Leopold's question, on this one and on others, it would be helpful to sort of say, this is in the, such and such a category in terms of time, and others will take longer. But I think we don't want to create false expectations about how long things take, and I'll just hand it back there. But again, I am guessing, based on the conversations we've already had as a committee and the conversations we've had with staff, that some of the things we're going to be talking about in the next couple of months are going to be relatively short-term within the framework of how things at the FAA move, and others are going to be longer-term. So why don't you try and respond to both that set of questions?
So for timing, Class B airspace, and when we do Class C airspace. It takes time to get through that. I mean, it's a long process, particularly anything that goes through rulemaking. So when it goes through rulemaking, there is a process that goes along with that in the FAA. It's very, very spelled out. I mean, you can research it and find out every particular point along the way, and it gets put in as a rule. Pilots have to follow that, and they get violated for not following that. I mean, when you talk about violations, that's where violations occur. So there is a process for that. Developing new procedures, for all the members here, if we talk about developing new procedures, we're going to have to go through a similar process. It doesn't go through rulemaking, but it's still a process that has to go through. The diagram that we had up there that showed the approach plate for the surfer, I mean, that's a very simple one-page diagram. It takes a lot of work to put into that, to go through and engineer that and make sure that there's all the safety and the separation from aircraft, and all the GPS components work in the aircraft. There's a lot of work that goes involved in that. So they're not, it's not a weak process to go through some of these things. These are major changes.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, when we met with you in July of last year, there was concern about the speed brakes, and one of the engineers said, oh, we could fix this out by the time we get to the parking lot. And that wasn't fixed, and it was a bigger problem. And I'm not expecting anything in a week or a month, but I can't tell of all the different choices we have here, A1B, A2, which one are rulemaking, which one aren't, what might be a range of time about things. Because one of the things that I heard very clearly from Congresswoman Eshoo when in a meeting we had in March with Mr. Martin, I think you were there as well, is there something that could be done in the short term to really help alleviate some of these problems? And I don't know what those are, and I won't pretend I do, but trying to figure out which of these pieces are something that could offer some relief to the problems that are there right now would be helpful as we go along. It's when I appreciate, as someone who flies in a plane, all the safety work that goes on, right? I want to make sure that my plane lands without hitting any other planes, so thank you for that. And I know that it's a long process, but it's frustrating to see that a descent was created without the associated work done on the Class B airspace at the same time, so we could optimize it right from the get-go instead of having the problems, which you didn't expect and we clearly didn't expect. And so trying to figure out what we can do in the short term and the long term makes a big difference for us. And making sure that these meetings, I'm sure that these meetings that we'll have about this Class B airspace will actually take place in Santa Cruz County, unlike the first meetings that went on. I'm sure now that we'll have some meeting in Santa Cruz County, but I imagine that we'll get lots of people there as well. So I just, as we move through this, or maybe in time for the next meeting, if you could just tell us which one of these feasible options are going to have to go through rulemaking or not go through rulemaking, and give us, so we have some idea. I mean, I don't know the relative awareness of my colleagues. I can only speak for myself, but I can't tell which is a short-term piece and which is a long-term piece. And if there's some way for you to indicate that to us, that would be helpful. And I think would be helpful for the public.
Okay. Thank you. Going to go to Mr. G, and then I've got a question to try and bottom line it, and then we're going to go to Mr. Adiego. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What would be helpful for me using this chart here is to do a couple things. Number one is to transpose or put on top the design procedure from the first slide, so we can see the variation of the actual flight tracks versus the design procedure, as well as to really pinpoint. I'm assuming this blue vertical bar is where Brix flies underneath. Similar to this chart, the planes flying Brix probably aren't just a pinpoint. There's probably a range. So to just put that circle of whatever those airplanes are flying, bricks, so that we see where that conflict is. And the subsequent slide from this, the leveling off, I just want to make sure everyone understands, or at least I understand, that when a plane has to level off, that means more noise versus just the OPD. I just want to make sure, is that correct?
Generally, there's more noise when you're leveling off. If you're coming off of an OPD and leveling off, you're going to generate more noise.
Because there's just
Generally
more airplane
speaking.
maneuvers and things moving and speeds and all that stuff. So in theory, we want to minimize the leveling off, or the more leveling off procedures, the more noise.
Correct.
Aircraft. You mentioned it as we go through this Class B examination here, there may be the potential to give back Class B someplace else. Could you take a moment to hypothetically, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean less constraints in the regional airspace if we were to give back Class B someplace else? I'm not sure what that means, so maybe you can help me.
So the Class B airspace, along with the high level of safety that goes along with it, there's a lot of management associated with that airspace. So as we're going through and looking at making changes, if there are areas in the Class B airspace right now that aren't really being utilized, that may be an opportunity to reduce that classification to another class of airspace.
Does that just mean less management, or does that mean less constraints for procedures, or all of the above until you study it?
Well, I don't, if it had something to do with procedures, we probably wouldn't change the airspace. So I wouldn't say it had anything to do with the procedures.
I just struggling to understand what give back and what the benefits of giving back Class B.
Well, because there's other classes of airspace that pilots will use that want to use that airspace. So if you reduce the safety level and you're not having the high performing aircraft going through that area, then that kind of gives it back to some of the lower performing aircraft to utilize that airspace.
So does that mean potentially other aircraft could be in other places?
It could.
Excuse me.
Does it mean that other aircraft could and would be flying in airspace newly available to them that was not available to them when Class B was in place in its earlier configuration?
Potentially, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So then, following that up on sort of the crystal ball here, if I heard why the OPD came and the challenges with Class B, what steps are, as in the FAA rule book about Class B creep 20 years from now? I mean, if I understood the presentation correctly, some of these OPD flight tracks are the reason of high-performance aircraft gliding into the airport through OPD, and there's always constantly new aircraft being designed and developed. If they take a longer descent, lower slope, how do we, 20 years from now, not be back in a meeting that Chairman Simonian is going to be chairing 20 years from now?
Term limits are good things in some cases, Mr. May.
This is a House Select Committee. But how do we, how does this thing not keep creeping? I'm just curious.
The airspace is going to continue evolving, so there's
So we just, as communities, we just need to be mindful of potential.
evolution of the airspace, absolutely.
And I guess my final question is there a subsequent slide, maybe it's further in a different agenda, but it's very informative of the sort of the range of aircraft flying this procedure, but it stops at Swells. I'd be curious to see it go left over Menlo to see, for my colleagues here from Menlo Park and Palo Alto, and communities around that, how wide the variety of aircraft are flying over Menlo at a much lower altitude. So if this chart could just move left over to the Menlo waypoint, it'd be very interesting, I think illuminating to all of us.
Okay, so if we can address that when we're talking about the Surfer Menlo, we
Okay,
could do that.
that's where it's gonna be.
This is
Okay.
primarily for the Class B in those
Okay.
2 areas where it's coming out.
So I can expect when we get to item 1A2 to see the chart go left. Okay, thank you.
All right, I want to step in more fully here for a minute, and then we're going to go to Mr. Bodorf and then to Mr. Hindi. Thank you. Mr. May, I think you know from the first day the committee was impaneled back in early May, it has been my goal to try and simplify the conversation rather than complicate the conversation, understanding that it's a very complicated conversation. In fact, I might even go so far as to say it's my goal to oversimplify if I possibly can, because I do feel like we're sometimes lost in the weeds. And I get that it's complex, and that in no way is meant to diminish the challenge of the exercise that we've asked you to face, so please understand that. That being said, I want to repeat what I think I understand the situation to be, and then ask you a couple of questions if my baseline understanding is correct. And if my baseline understanding is incorrect, do not be shy. Just tell me, Supervisor, you got it wrong, here's how it is. My understanding is that there's something called OPD, and that that's a descent flight path, and that you've got one out there, you've designed it, we know what it is. My understanding is that there's something called Class B airspace, which is the place you're supposed to fly pursuant to a certain set of rules. And that the problem is that the Class B airspace design doesn't work with the descent path that has been created. Am I right so far?
Yes.
And the reason that's relevant, as I understand it, based on what you've told us, the reason that's relevant to a conversation about noise is because every time you have to stair step back in to the Class B airspace, that requires a set of maneuvers which by their nature are noisy. Am I still right?
More noisy than if you were to stay on the OPD, yes.
Got it. So one potential solution that has been identified is to change the airspace configuration so that it fits the flight path, so that people are making fewer of those maneuvers that are noisier. Still right?
Yes.
Okay. And then the question, and Supervisor Leopold's asked some questions about how long that would take, and that's helpful and important for us to know, I think. And then so the reason things would be better, quote unquote, or less noisy, is because if the Class B airspace is reconfigured so that people can stay on that flight path without these maneuvers, they'll be making fewer of these noisier maneuvers. Here's my next question. If you change the Class B airspace, is that going to be objectionable to somebody else because it becomes noisier for them? In other words, is there an adverse consequence that we should be aware of before tinkering with the Class B airspace?
I have not seen any noise analysis for the Class B, so I cannot answer that.
Okay. No, that's, folks, whoa, that's why we're having the conversation, because one of the things we're going to be asked to do by now, we're hoping November the 17th, is to give some recommendations to our members of Congress. So that's going to be a thing that I think we're all going to want to know, because right now, as we sit and listen, I'm inclined to say, well, gee, this sounds like a happy outcome for a Friday afternoon. You know, we're just going to change the airspace and life will get quieter. That being said, the one thing you've taught me over the last 3 months is that actions have consequences, sometimes unintended and more complicated than initially understood. So could we ask you to specifically come back to us with a response to that at a subsequent meeting, because I think that's going to be an important part of the conversation about Class B. Is that a reasonable request?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Class B airspace is one of the items that's been identified as feasible. I think I understand why it will be quieter if we amend or modify the Class B airspace. But before we head down that path, I just want to make sure that I haven't given some other community or set of communities a sharp elbow without knowing what's involved. Okay?
Understand.
I think I'm going now to Mr. Bodorf, and then to Mr. Hindi, and then to Mr. Adiego.
Great. Just a couple quick questions. Safety is our first concern, and there was some brought up recently, I think Gary brought up, about the possible moving of Menlo to Rockney, and you mentioned in your comment, you said it's a little close. And just for specifics, I know you have some guidelines that we live by, and when you say it's a little close to San Jose Class C, what does that mean?
My estimate is about a mile to the San Jose Class B from Rockme.
Okay. And what's your safe buffer zone for?
So they typically like to keep procedures about 1.5 miles away from a border class.
Okay, I just wanted some specifics so I understood it.
Yeah.
And the last question is, I just want to know in regards to the old Big Sur route, was leveling off part of that descent? Was there leveling off that was in that old route?
Yeah, there was, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Hindi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. May, if I understand correctly, the modification of Class B airspace would be roughly about 18 months?
Mr. Hindi, could you pull the mic a little closer, please? It will come to you. Thank you.
Is that correct?
Typical Class B airspace is about an 18 to 24-month process.
And you have mentioned that there will still be leveling off due to sequencing and separation. So my question is, going through this exercise for roughly about 18 months, what is the expectation of the FAA? How much improvement from leveling off from the current situation after you modify, say you modify Class B airspace? What kind of percentage would you be looking at reduction, or what is your objective?
Improvement and reduction of what? I don't know what you're
Of
referring
the
to.
leveling off. Because you're still going to have some leveling off due to sequencing and separation, correct?
So
So
you're
if you
saying-
modify the Class B, you take care of the OPD problem. But the sequencing and separation part, the airplane's still going to have to level off. So what kind of reduction and leveling off you would looking for if you fix that space B?
I don't think we've run numbers that look at that.
Okay? So could it be that we go through this exercise, there'll be some improvement, but not significant improvement? Or would you still say you will have significant improvement?
I would expect that there would be less leveling off by changing the Class B if that moves forward and it contain that procedure. By how much, we have not looked at that.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it's Mr. Adiego to be followed by Councilmember Bernal.
Thank you. I think Mayor Botov asked my question, but I just wanted to be clear. So prior to next-gen Surfer and OP descent, when aircraft were coming in Big Sur approach, they would have the same dilemma with Class B airspace. They would have to step through it.
Correct.
Okay. And so the OPD approach, if it shifted to Big Sur, it would have the same, the approach would be the same dilemma.
Can we talk about that in the Big Surfer conversation?
I'll make a note.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Bernal.
I think Mayor Adiego might have gotten to my question, but I'm not sure. There was leveling off at Big Sur, correct?
Yes.
It is big. And does that occur because of sequencing, or does it occur as part of the OPD?
It's going to be the same thing on any of the procedures.
Okay. When we get to, I know this is coming, time management, will we be seeing an opportunity for less sequencing as a result of that, so that there should be less leveling off that will follow?
Generally speaking, any of the time-based metering is going to reduce sequencing of
So we'll
aircraft.
have that conversation.
Generally speaking.
Generally speaking, okay. On this page that we're on right now, there's a very wide window on Surfer at Epic. Is there any way that we can amend that, or is that a reflection of the number and different types of planes that we have in the air at this point? Because it's so wide, it could possibly contribute to some of the leveling off. Is that right?
Your question is, can we amend?
Can we-
Amend what?
Can we tweak it to amend it so it's not so
The
wide?
procedure?
Yes,
So that those orange lines aren't so wide?
yes.
Okay, so most likely, we talked about the different fleet mix. They're all going to
Yes.
come down at a different
yes.
glide path,
Yes.
okay? Based on the weight, the aerodynamics of the aircraft itself. So, I mean, if they're on OPDs and you're seeing that dispersion, I mean, I can kind of see I can see two real thick lines when I'm looking at it.
Right.
Real dense lines going
Yes.
through there.
Yes.
So those are probably two predominant aircraft that are flying this that have different profiles.
My concern is for the ones that are up higher and then having to come down and then level off at some point.
Ms. Bernald, excuse me, I just want to make sure I'm following the conversation. I think we're having a conversation about the thickness of layers in the layer cake. Is that what we're talking about? Is how thick or thin is that in terms of flying through it, or we're providing space? If not, I'm struggling to get
I'm talking about the disbursement of the traffic.
within a layer, or
I'm talking about the window that they are given
Yeah.
there at
Yeah.
Epic.
okay.
And again, this goes to Mr. G's comment about improvement over time, improvement of aircraft. Is there any way that we can narrow that so we don't have quite as much of a descent profile on there that does require leveling off?
So let me comment on that, and I think this needs to be part of the surfer discussion.
Yes.
There's a window on each one of these waypoints. If you remember back to that approach plate, there was that ceiling and the floor, right? Okay, look at the waves. See
Yes.
the FL 190, 15,000? That's flight level 190, which is 19,000 feet to 15,000 feet. Epic is 10 to 15. There's that window in there to capture that variability in the aircraft, the performance of that aircraft. So you have to have that window on there. You can't give it a designated altitude that far out and expect every single aircraft to be able to fly that. So to answer your question, there may be an opportunity for that, but that depends on what the procedure looks like. This was the window that was given to this procedure right here. If there's modifications to it, they're going to look at all those waypoints and look what's feasible with the fleet mix that fly that particular procedure.
Okay. Again, I think we're all sitting up here looking for the best optimal descent
Right.
profile we can get. There is another factor that is in that, and that is the ATC and descent via. And we look at 8 or 10,000 feet. Is that something that we as a committee can suggest to you that be in the mix for Class B for adjusting because of the leveling off that occurs as a result of the descent via?
I can't tell you not to suggest anything. You can suggest.
I understand that and I appreciate it, but I want to know if I can get an answer that is doable from the FAA.
On descend via to 10 or 8 as part of the Class B?
Well, within that window. We've got descent via right now that sometimes goes to 8. That's one of the problems that we have with how things are working. You know, I think we all would like to know who the lovely lady is sitting next to you. It would be helpful if we don't know. Yes.
Oh, this is Mindy Wright. She
Yeah.
works in our operations support group out of Seattle.
Out of Seattle.
And
Wonderful.
with
And Steve Carnes is to her right. He works out of Seattle also in our operations support group.
Okay, great.
So while I have their attention here, I'd like to thank them for putting together all the graphics and analysis that goes along with our presentations.
And the notes that she's writing you. So is there a reaction to descent via and the ATC? Can we change? Is that something that the FAA will respond to if we say something in terms of how we would like to see the descent via occur or not occur?
I'm not sure how to answer that associated with the Class B.
Okay.
That's what I'm struggling with here.
Mr. May, is there a bucket, given our 6 buckets of feasible
Yeah.
actions, where that question is sort of better addressed in your
The
judgment?
surfer,
Surfer,
Yeah, I
okay,
mean,
come
we're
on.
talking about
It's
the
going to be a
surfer
great
procedure.
conversation
It's
next
gonna be a
time.
really big
There's a
one.
lot
Yeah.
to talk about on the surfer.
Yeah.
All right, good. that work for you?
Yeah, it
Ms.
does.
Burnell?
You show me a surfer slide, I'm sorry, I'm going into that mode.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let me,
okay.
before I go back to Mr. Waldeck, let me just say, anything else from this side of the panel? Not at the moment. Mr. Waldeck?
One quick question. If you modify the Class B airspace, will it affect your interaction with the BRICS arrival out into San Jose?
Can you repeat that one more time?
If you go ahead and in effect lower the Class B requirements going out to Santa Cruz from San Francisco, I think that's what you want to do. You want to lower those layers. How's that going to affect the BRICS arrival, if any, and what kind of a problem are you going to have?
It
Or have you
shouldn't
looked at
affect the BRICS arrival at all.
I think it already conflicts at one point, so unless you've moved it, does it not yet aggravate that situation?
Steve, can you pull up the chart that has the BRICS, the blue line on it, vertical blue line?
Yeah, right there where it crosses, right there, at least in its original incarnation, they were at exactly the same point. And so my question is, if you lower Class B, the BRICS arrival starts roughly at 4,000 feet, I think. I don't remember the exact altitudes, but they do conflict there. And so the question is, if you were to lower a Class B by lowering these layers to allow, quote, the OPD within the existing Class B airspace, would not that interact with the BRICS arrival and consequently create a different problem for you?
I'm not going to say it's going to create a problem. It could potentially have a connection to the BRICS. I don't know what that is right now. But looking at it, it's right in the area where it's going to be modified. So
Certainly
it could,
is. Yeah. Thank you.
Let me suggest that on that point, since we're going to be coming back to this issue for further conversation, including but not limited to the question asked earlier that I raised about making sure that a modification of Class B does not do damage to other communities, that would be a time to be able to revisit and say, we went and took a closer look at BRICS, and we can now reassure you yet again that that's not an issue. Does that work for you, Mr. May?
yes, absolutely.
Great. Last call on this item for today. All right, then we'll say thank you for that. And the next item, 1A2, is the surfer discussion, which is, as I mentioned earlier in the meeting, we're going to move to first meeting in August. So that takes us to 1A3, increasing percentage of night flights, which remain on night until at least the night waypoint. So thank you for presenting on this, and if you will explain the various terms just briefly so that everybody's working from a common vocabulary, that would be helpful.
Okay. Just a couple introductory remarks onto this. These next three items on the agenda that we're going to look at, there's some similarities to them. So maybe just keep that in mind as we go through them. The primary purpose on these three agenda items is to keep the aircraft over the water. I mean, that's really what that's the similarity behind all of these. So that's what.
And we have more than one place that people think of as the water. So when you say over the water, what are you thinking
It could be the San Francisco Bay. It could also be the Pacific Ocean.
Great, thank you.
So we'll see that in a couple of different cases. Okay? But leave the aircraft over water as much as feasible and try not to turn them early over land. And that's really the theme that you'll see through all of these. So the NITE that you see there is a procedure, NIITE. That's a procedure very similar to the surfer. This particular procedure is a departure procedure off of San Francisco Airport. It's actually designed to depart off of two different runways, depending on wind and other factors. So it can either take off of the 28 runway, which is that. So you can see San Francisco Airport's a little blue dot down on the very bottom of the screen right there. So that's the airport. The white line that goes off to the left is the departure for the 28 runways. So it kind of goes off and then makes a right turn and heads up and then joins the procedure up there near that waypoint that is Galu waypoint, right around in that area. The other, which is more predominantly used, is a departure off the one runway, and that goes off out over the bay, and then turns to try and stay right down the center of the San Francisco Bay, on up there, and then right at that point there, that's the night waypoint, which is part of the night procedure.
Would you circle that again and just say that again, please?
Right where the cursor is the night waypoint,
Thank you.
and this is on the night procedure, okay? So, can you flip one slide back, Steve? So what we're looking at, no, the title there, yeah, is now we want to look at increasing the percentage of night flights, so that's the night procedure, which remain on the night procedure until the night waypoint. So that's the objective. And if you can go to the next slide, Steve. So now if we look at the procedure itself, those are the orange flight tracks. Again, predominantly come off of runway 1, they go up, and then you can kind of see them start fanning off to the east before they get to the night waypoint. All right, so about 35% of those flights are vectored off of the night departure procedure. That's the SID, Standard Instrument Departure, prior to the night waypoint. And if you look at the next slide, same exact flight tracks, look a little bit differently because we're looking at altitude parameters rather than just the flight track. So again, same exact flight tracks, but you can see, some of them are coming off. You can see it a little bit clearer here where they're coming off and making that right-hand turn before that night waypoint. Okay? So the objective and what we determined was feasible was to keep the aircraft on that procedure longer, all the way to at least that night waypoint, and then start turning them to the east. So that's something that we're already working with the local facility on finding ways to be able to do that at a higher utilization rate. Okay, the next one is to create a new south transition for the night SID. Next slide, Steve. So SID is the Standard Instrument Departure. So we're referencing the same exact procedure. Steve, if you can just point to San Francisco Airport. Thank you. Now, yeah, right there. So there's the airport. You can see the white line going off to the right, all the way up to the night procedure. That's the same procedure we just looked at. Okay, this particular bucket that we're looking at is trying to accommodate something else. So the green procedures, these are aircraft that are now heading southbound out of San Francisco that are coming back over the peninsula. So there was a proposal, and we looked at the feasibility of, rather than following those green flight tracks where they take off of runway 1, loop back around and come back over the peninsula, is they follow something like the night procedure all the way up to that night waypoint, and then turn left out over the Golden Gate Bridge, out to the ocean, and then work their way back down south over the peninsula. They're going to be at a much, much higher altitude by the time they get to that point. Okay?
Mr. May, I'm going to interrupt you here to ask a couple of questions and also to reference some of the community feedback we got. Could I ask you to go back to the first slide, please?
Yeah.
All right, I lied. The second slide, thank you. I think there's another one.
One more.
That's the one, thank you. So, the notion was that you would increase the percentage of night flights which remain on night until at least the night waypoint. So I look at this slide and I see that thick orange line which comes out of SFO, and that represents departures of flights from SFO. And because they're all coming off the runway, they are understandably all where they're supposed to be at that point. They haven't dispersed yet going farther. Then as we go up, and maybe an inch on my map and 5 or 6 on yours, yes, then all of a sudden we start to see the orange strands peeling off to the east, and that shows that those folks have not in fact stayed on the path to the night waypoint. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And then you may recall that when the 6 buckets were first announced, there was some concern from folks in our area, going back to that slide if we could please, thank you. There was some concern from folks in our area, and by our area I mean the whole San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz area, that these solutions didn't provide any relief for our area, quote unquote. And I think that may in part have been because as I look at this particular rendering, it says, oh, okay, a bunch of people won't be heading east early, and that may be a good thing, but how does it help San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz counties? So you following my thinking so far?
Yeah.
Okay. But I think that you were about to tell us that getting more of the flights that depart to stay on the flight path to the night waypoint does in fact help folks in the peninsula. Did I get that right so far? Go 2 more slides. So tell us what the good news is on this one again?
Okay, so let me go back to what you started on. That's a different problem that we're trying to solve. That's a different bucket. And I would actually say you're pretty correct in how you were characterizing that. There's not a lot, there's very little on that bucket there that I could see that benefits the Mid-South Peninsula.
But here, go ahead. So tell us again what's happening on this slide, the different
Well,
thing.
let me just say why that is there. When we put the feasibility study together, remember, we responded to public input last year prior to the select committee being established. So we looked at everything, all right? So everything that's in that report covers all of the input that we got. That happens to be one that just may be outside of the area of the committee here, okay? But it's there, so we wanted to present that to the committee, okay? Am I good on that?
For the moment, yes.
Okay, so now this one here does impact the area that you're looking at here.
And just start from the beginning again on this one, if you would.
Okay, so let's back up to and let's read through it again. So this is to create a new south transition for the night SID, the night departure. Right now, the night SID is used for northern departures. Okay, so the idea was born to, well, let's use that departure profile. It goes out over the bay and take them all the way up to the night and then loop them back around. So that's kind of how this, to me, got connected to the night departure. Okay? So if you can go to the next slide, Steve. So right where the, again, San Francisco Airport for me, Steve, if you can just hover over that. That's the airport. The green lines are the flight tracks for the procedure in question, which are going to be the stick procedure. All right? So those green lines are the stick procedure off of San Francisco. It's a departure procedure. And it loops around, like you can see, and comes over the mid-peninsula. These are for aircraft heading southbound. So the proposal was to use the night procedure, either use it, modify it, amendment, create another procedure that has the same, flight track as that. But the idea is to get it up at least to that night waypoint and out through the Golden Gate Bridge, out to the ocean, and then back down over the peninsula at a much higher altitude. That's the objective.
Got it. So it may simply be that what's confusing to me is that we have language on our agenda that says increasing the percentage of night flights which remain on night until at least the night waypoint, and that is something you're interested in doing, and that was the orange strands that are headed east.
Right.
I understand that. But really, for our conversation here, in terms of concerns that are San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz County based, perhaps the heading should have been change some of the stick departures to night departure routes. Is that a fair characterization of what this slide is talking about? Because aren't you telling me these green flights are the stick departures?
Okay, so
currently?
you're saying on item number 4, right? Little IV
no, I'm on
4?
item,
Because that's what we're on right now.
okay. So we've transitioned, that may be where I
Yes.
got lost, I
Yeah.
apologize. So we've transitioned from 3 to 4.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't mean this in a flip way.
That's okay.
So I now know that I don't care much about 3, all due respect, because that's not my responsibility.
I totally understand.
So now I'm on to 4, and what you're saying is, what's good for the folks in number 3 would be good for the folks in number 4, and we're on stick, which is, let's get them on night, let's keep them on night, and if we do that, they'll be following the white line that you have on this map, yes?
Yeah, but it's not just getting them on stick and getting them on night and keeping them on night. It'd be creating a new procedure, either amending the night to create a south transition on that procedure or creating a new procedure. There's not a procedure that exists for what this is trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
Okay.
I apologize if everybody else got it and I didn't, but now I get it. So,
And if I can just add one more statement in there.
Please.
I apologize. Both the first bucket and this one here, these are dealing with nighttime procedures. Okay, we're focused on nighttime procedures.
and for all of us and everyone in the room and everyone who'll be listening raptly to the tapes or whatever we call them now that they're digitized, nighttime is defined as from when to when again? Okay. Sometime afternoon, I'm going to bet. All right.
So, I mean, in the context of this here, we're generally looking at from 1 to 6 in the morning.
1 to 6, okay. Okay. All right. If we can refine that at another meeting, that will be great. But I do think that just one member of the committee, I think, again, this one shows some promise, which is instead of having folks take off at night when folks are trying to sleep and circle back down the peninsula at relatively low altitudes, as you said earlier, if you can push them out over water, help them get to higher altitudes before they make the U-turn and head south. Sounds like that's a promising solution. I do think it would be nice to know what time nighttime is. I'm guessing many of the folks who care about this issue go to bed before 1 in the morning, and their definition of night may be a little bit different than the technical definition. All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Mr. Potter?
Yeah, first I want to say, Mr. May, thank you, because I really believe that you're trying to make an effort to provide something. And I want to go back. I know that it doesn't affect us. Those flights are all going to the east. We're wondering what's the impact. But I sit here, and this is a regional committee, and even though that's out of our region, this is a positive move for noise reduction. And what I see out of this, what I got right away, which I want to say thank you to, because you're not going to hear that word too often, but I want to say it right now, is you're trying to get us to utilize the night waypoint, to keep the planes on tonight. You're going to keep them from fanning off to go to the east. But what you said that I got was you want to try to utilize or create a system that's going to take the planes from night through the Golden Gate out under the ocean, and this is what we're asking for. So I see this as something that I think we could all probably shake our heads on. We don't need 8 votes. I think you might even get 12 with the ideas like this. So I want to seize the moment to embrace that I think this is something in a positive direction, and I'm okay with providing some relief for, I guess that's Martinez or Concord or someplace up there that all those planes are fanning over. But the idea that you want to embrace the night point and you're willing to utilize that path, stay over the bay, try to go out into the ocean and come back over that congested area that was affected at 3, 4, 5,000 feet higher, I think is a very positive move at this point. So thank you.
On these, I'm going to call them 2 items so far that we've let you get to 3 and 4. Is that pretty much where we are, Mr. May?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see if there are other comments or questions. Mr. G, and then anybody else on this side before I go to this side, and then to Mr. Leopold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. May, on these 2 items here, the way I was trying to look at it, if the planes stay up to the night waypoint before they make a left or right turn, what's the altitude? I was looking at about 7 or 8, 8,000, 10,000?
I don't know what that is.
I mean, it would be helpful just to know where they're at.
Okay, so the dark blue, looking at this,
That's what I was trying to figure out. It's around
10
10,000.
to 11 is dark blue.
So they're going to
You
be
have a little, that purple color, I can see a little purple right in that area, so that's 9 to 10.
So they're going to be up about 10,000 plus
Yeah.
in that range, so that would be very helpful before they make a turn.
Yeah.
And then on the second item, I just want us to make sure that this slide here, I guess, if we endorse this change, I know it will provide relief on the North County because the departures are the departures. San Bruno and South San Francisco will appreciate that. But I would also want to make sure that when those planes come back over the, I don't know if that's Pacifica, that's probably south of Pacifica, but making sure where those planes cross back over land are high enough so that we don't add another voice to this challenge about making sure we're not introducing noise into another community between 1 and 6 a.m. So they need to be up there. I don't know what the right altitude is, but as you model this, if we do go forward, you know, we already hear, at least at the roundtable, issues from Pacifica about low-flying aircraft. We don't want to introduce a new aircraft between 1 and 6 a.m.
I understand what you're saying. If you look at the green lines right where that dotted arrow is, those aircraft would have been right over that area at a much lower altitude, same aircraft.
But if we're going to make more of them?
No, it's just rather than taking the green path,
I would just say let's just make sure, as our chairman said, with the other item, we model it so that we can make an informed decision and not be surprised that we've brought more other things to a different community.
And Mr. May, I'm just so you know, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I think we are, which is any flight that is now on the dotted white path is one less flight that is on the green path going over at a lower altitude. Yes?
yes.
Okay. Mr. Leopold has indicated he's going to pass on his previous comment or question, but again, coming down this way, no other questions or comments on this? Yes, Mr. Waldeck.
Just one rebuttal here a little bit, or come back. Can you define when these routes would be in use? You said sometime between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. I'm wondering if we can make it from 12:59 to maybe midnight or something like that. I'm being a little facetious here, but you know, if I see no reason not to do it, but I'm sure you do. So I was curious why the hours you picked.
It depends on this procedure, as it's titled, the night procedure, was designed for nighttime usage.
I concur. My question is, why not do it all the time?
So the 1 o'clock is not a hard 1 o'clock. It's not like the procedure just turns on at 1 o'clock and it's not available before that. All right, the procedure's there. It's the demand and the flow at San Francisco that is dependent on when that procedure can start being used.
Okay. I understand the point. I'm just trying to get as much over there. And just a follow-up question. You folks here are FAA, and we have someone there in San Francisco who's one of the airport traffic controllers. And I'm just curious what the relationship is between you and how much flexibility they have to direct traffic away perhaps from one of these standard procedures. And my impression is that I'll let me back up. The entry points from the Point Reyes Bodega arrivals, at one point there was a predominance of coming across the top part of the San Francisco Bay, down the middle of the bay, and then making a right turn into 28. Now the predominance seems to be over Menlo Park and Woodside in that area, and it looks to me like it's a procedure called decision on some of these final flight paths as opposed to a standard that they're supposed to administer or follow. And so my question goes into how much control do you exhibit over the choice of routes that they have, and can we in fact start shifting some of those arrivals back down the middle of the bay the way they used to be?
The facilities, when we're talking about utilizing a facility, it's the pilot that chooses the procedure that they're going to utilize. All right, so that's different than working on designing and implementing procedures.
Okay.
As far as
That's part of my
designing and
question,
implementing
yeah.
procedures, the facilities are engaged when we design and implement facilities, procedures.
We'll come back to it. I'll let it go for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Bernal.
2 questions. This does look really good. But being from Santa Clara County, I'd like to know if we have any idea of what the altitude is when it gets over south of where that arrow is. Are we at 10, 15 by that time?
So that arrow there is a very conceptual arrow.
Yeah.
First off, I can tell you an aircraft can't make that angle of turn, like on that arrow.
Right.
It's just, it was a concept that was born out of the comments that we got back. So we'd have to start putting pencils on paper and looking at where that actually would go and altitudes and everything else. But as what was brought up earlier, if you look back at the night, they're at about 10,000 feet at that night waypoint. So they're going to continue climbing from that point on.
So if we could go back, I'd like some clarification. I see a ridge that it's aiming for as it goes south, that arrow. If it's at 10,000 feet and it's going over the Santa Cruz Mountains at 10,000 feet, it's not necessarily a good thing.
But the
If
green
it's
ones that are
10,000
under it
when
are
it's
at,
turning, so it continues to go up. It was the 10,000 when it turns off of night. Is that right then?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. And then you almost touched on the question that I'm asking now, I think when you were talking to Councilmember Waldeck about procedure and when it's going to go into effect. You've already started to talk about this. When is this a 18-month to 2-month, a 24-month?
So if we were to move forward and develop a procedure, you know, going back to the comment about rulemaking, a procedure does not go through rulemaking. There's still a process that it goes through. It typically takes 18 months to develop a procedure, but it's different than going through the rulemaking process. So that's a typical schedule that we use.
Okay, thank you.
I can't resist. So the good news is it's the fast path. The bad news is the fast path takes 18 months. Got it. No, I think Supervisor Leopold's earlier admonition to us all about sort of making sure we understand how long things take is an important one as we go through the process. So, Mr. Adiego, did I see you leaning forward? No? All right, let me just, we have been on A, 3, and 4, and unless there are further questions or comments on this, I think we're ready to move on to A5. All right, then, Mr. May, I'll say thank you, and please proceed. And again, I very much appreciate your brief descriptions of the technical terms of art that you're using.
Okay. So this is item 5 on the agenda, 2A5. We're talking about increasing the percentage of candle flights. So candle is a procedure which remain on the candle procedure until at least the candle waypoint. So it's very similar to the night, we're just looking at a different procedure. So let's move on. I'll try and outline the procedure. These are departures that come off of Oakland Airport. Oakland Airport is right where that cursor is. And you can see the orange flight tracks that proceed northwest. The procedure for the candle should take them out to that waypoint right there. That's the candle waypoint on the candle procedure that's circled. And then the procedure brings them back down to the port down on the bottom left. Okay, that's how the procedure is designed. The aircraft turn off of that early for sequencing of other aircraft in the area. So the objective is, if you can just go back one more time, now that we looked at it, I want to read through it one more time. Back one slide, Steve. So we want to increase the percentage of candle flights. So these are candle flights that are on the procedures that remain on that procedure until at least that candle waypoint. Okay, next slide, Steve. So those ones that are turning before that candle to the left and coming back down over the bay. So the proposal was to keep them on the procedure until they get to that candle and then turn them south. So the objective is they have a higher altitude when they start crossing over the...
And Mr. May, when we say that they are vectored off the candle prior to the candle waypoint, who is it that is telling them that they should do that?
Air traffic controllers.
And is that the folks at Oakland? Is it the folks at Fremont/Oakland? Or is it the folks at NorCal Tracon up in Sacramento? Or all the above?
The later Northern California Tracon NCT.
Okay, thank you.
So about 60% of the candle flights are vectored off the candle SID prior to the waypoint, so there is some room for improvement there. That bar right to the left there, I guess that thick bar where the arrow is pointing to, just as a side note there, that's predominantly A320 aircraft. And if you remember the conversation we had on the vortex generators would relate to those aircraft right there.
Okay.
Next slide, Steve. Same exact flight tracks, you just have your altitude identifiers on each one of those. So you can see right about at the candle, just roughly looking at the colors there, kind of that light greenish going from yellow to blue, right around the 5,000–6,000 foot would be about where they're at when they get to the candle. So it keep them at that elevation, and then they continue climbing as they come around. So again, this is something that the air traffic control facilities are already looking at and trying to find ways that we can get better utilization of those aircraft staying on that candle.
If you could go back to your last relevant slide, is this the one? And so this would be your idea of the goal, meaning to have folks stay on the procedure to the candle waypoint.
Correct.
And then make the sharp south west turn that we know is not quite like that.
Right.
And then follow along, in theory, the white line that is there. Is that correct?
That's correct. So if you see the cursor, how the cursor's moving, they're probably going to follow something more along that flight path, come back down, and then fly over the port.
But the white line that is there is designed to represent what?
So that connects the dots in between the procedure. The aircraft's not necessarily going to make that sharp U-turn and just follow right along that. It's going to take a wider turn.
Okay. So even if that is the, quote, established procedure, you're telling us that we're likely to see flights that are...
They're going to arc up and back around.
And so rather than be concentrated as they are at the beginning of the departure, they're going to be spread out over that area in these narrower strands, yes?
Correct.
Okay. And how does this help reduce noise for people in San Mateo, Santa Clara, or Santa Cruz County, if it does?
Well, if you look at, if you can go back, Steve, I can see it a little better. If you follow where the A380 line goes out, and just follow that out, Steve, and look at the coastline of the San Francisco area. So all those flights that are crossing right in that area would probably not be crossing right along that area if they had gone up to that candle and then started making their turn back around south. So it's all those...
Mr. Chairman, specifically Brisbane and South San Francisco, part of San Mateo County.
You know, I know it well. I know it well. So is it fair to say that this is the beneficial impact of this approach is predominantly centered on North San Mateo County, yes?
Yes.
I would say so, yeah.
Okay. And so if you're a Santa Cruz County resident, this one may not be at the top of your list of things to celebrate.
Could be.
Okay.
Unless you were regionally minded.
Unless you were regionally minded, and let me assure you, Santa Cruz County thinks globally as well as acts locally. As someone who's had the pleasure of representing Santa Cruz County, and in Santa Clara County, same thing, and even in South San Mateo County, not terribly relevant, but sounds like potentially significantly quite relevant in North San Mateo County, yes? Okay, good. I'm going to go to Ms. Wengert.
Just following on some of the questions and comments you made earlier about the timing for implementing, since this is not a rules change nor a procedural change, because you already have the candle in place and it's really a matter of trying to increase the usage of candle, what would be a realistic expectation for how quickly this might have a positive impact, even if it's only North County, San Mateo?
Well, I can speak to time frames as far as the utilizing that procedure to have the aircraft fly over the candle. I mean, that's something we're working on. We're actively talking with the controllers and looking at reasons why they don't do that and see how we can mitigate those as we're doing that. So you are correct, there's no lengthy procedure development process. There's no rulemaking associated with this. It's something that we often do at airports, and when we take an initiative on like this, we see incremental improvements. It's not like a procedure change where all of a sudden one day you're going to see a huge change. It's incremental changes. I mean, we just start picking at it and looking at reasons why that happens, and when they come up, discuss ways to mitigate it and alternatives to operate the traffic.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Mayor Lynn next.
And just to follow up on that, would that be the same even with night? Isn't that something that
Correct.
you're
Yes.
already using? And,
Yes.
and if I'm understanding, it's partly just maybe, probably the wrong words, but retraining and changing habits for, and procedures for the pilots and the controllers to start utilizing that different pattern more. So part of that is just getting that procedure more actively used?
I wouldn't, I mean, these are new procedures. I wouldn't say retraining so much on these. It's looking at ways to utilize this procedure more.
Encourage that direction.
Yeah, it's more of starting off and finding ways and encouraging that and educating the workforce, yes.
But again, both of those things are not the hurdles that you have
Correct.
with a whole new system.
Right. That's correct.
Okay, for both, thank you.
Yeah.
Mayor Botarff.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to ask you a speculative question since you seem to be rather generous with your comments right now. If we could go to the next slide that shows the altitudes. So there isn't a procedure. I'm going to go back just a second, digress a little bit. We went back to night because you said there wasn't a procedure, so you couldn't talk about elevation. And to address Councilman Bernald's question, if I look at this map and I see that a candle is actually south of where night is that accurate?
Well, we don't have the night on there.
Or maybe close enough to the
They're
same
pretty
point. I'm looking at the
close.
mouth. I'm looking at the mouth of the
Okay, I
Golden Gate
didn't
Bridge.
spot the other one on there for a geographical reference, but
Well, night looked like it was located at the mouth of the Golden Gate, so that looks like it's north.
Right.
Okay, so if I see an elevation here on this map that shows that planes are at 5,000 about when they get to Candle, and night is north of that, and we had planes that were at 10,000 at night, where our concern is they circle out through the Golden Gate and come back over the landmass of Saratoga and other areas like that, what that elevation would be. And I can see on this map that they're able to get from 5,000 to 10,000 by the time they get to even where San Francisco Airport is. So speculation, it would appear that the jets have the capability to add significant elevation from that point. Are you getting my question, or?
I understand what you're saying, and there's a lot of distance in there, and there's each aircraft has a profile that it climbs at, so.
My
I
question is,
haven't done calculations, but like I said, there's a lot of distance in there for aircraft to climb.
So if I can see on this map that it goes from 5,000 to 10,000, I might assume that if it was at 10,000, it might be able to get to 15,000.
Reasonable assumption.
That was all. Thank you.
All right, looking down this length. Mr. G.
Thank you. So following up on that comment, I think the simplicity, following our chairman's attempt, the further the distance, the greater the opportunity to get higher, which means less noise at the ground level. But I mean, from a conceptual standpoint, so we can have aircraft go to Candle or Night Waypoint, they have a chance of getting higher before they're getting back over landmass and things like that. On the slide before this, could you go back to this slide before? While we may have some concerns about whether this benefits the region, doesn't this have consequences to SFO departures too, in terms of if there's not sequenced, we wind up vectoring departures out of SFO earlier, then they can complete their procedures off of port.
Are we on the right slide? Because I was thinking you were going to a different one.
No,
So this slide right here is what
This
you're...
slide is, I finished the other point.
Okay.
Just more distance, the opportunity to get higher, farther away airplanes from the ground.
Okay, can you repeat that now that I'm on the slide?
So on this slide, as we have aircraft not completing Candle completely,
Right.
doesn't this have consequences to departures out of SFO on the port procedure coming out, or any of the procedures coming north? When we have Oakland departures kind of
So, I mean,
cutting.
just generally speaking, there are dependencies between all of the procedures at Oakland, all the procedures at San Francisco, and all the procedures at San Jose.
Correct.
They all have dependencies.
So if we can get aircraft to fly Candle more completely, then we can get departures out of SFO to fly their procedures more completely, because the procedures are designed dependent upon one another. And so if we can get everyone to fly the procedures more completely, then aircraft can get higher and above the entire region potentially.
Okay.
And so I'm just trying to illustrate that point. And that's the benefit to the region, is if everyone can get
That's
to the
exactly
point.
what these are talking about, is to fly the procedures to
Right.
the waypoint.
But not only at Oakland Candle, but SFO also. Because those
Well,
departure.
the night is at SFO. That's what we talked about. The night is a departure at San Francisco.
Right. But Candle isn't just night procedures.
Candle is a procedure at Oakland.
Right.
No, but it has an impact from.
Excuse me?
Not just at the time of day, right? Night is only in the evening. Candle is all day long.
And so if we can get aircraft departing Oakland to fly the Candle procedure more completely, doesn't that benefit SFO departures and their departure procedures?
I can't answer that without looking at it.
Let me try and take a piece of this. And Mr. Chief, I can ask you to add one more phrase to your question. I heard you say, if we can get more, and these are departures out of Oakland we're talking about, just to be clear on the record, yes? So if we can get more flights to adhere to the Candle procedure, you were asking, and if Candle is not a evening-only exercise, but is during the day, doesn't the fact that these flights departing from Oakland provide some opportunity for improvement at San Francisco? Because why? What good thing should then happen as you think it through?
Because the codependency of the procedures at the two airports allows the flights out of SFO to fly their departing procedure more completely also. Because if the A320 is cutting short their procedure, doesn't that have an impact on SFO departures and their procedures?
And I think you're asking, if they get the heck out of the way, doesn't that make it easier for people to act right coming out of SFO?
Because the earlier presentation is, we're constrained with our airspace. One, there are trade-offs, there are consequences with procedures from the different airports. If everyone flew the procedure correctly, wouldn't we all benefit as a region?
I think this is a to-be-continued question, but if we could ask you when you come back the next time to let us know whether or not there are any, in this case, perhaps unanticipated benefits at SFO by virtue of taking this action at Oakland, that would be useful to know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does that work for you?
That works.
Okay, great. Let me look down this side again. We're good on this one. Let me look on this side. Mr. Waldeck?
Mr. May, I think this discussion on the Candle departures, you're, I think, focusing on the controllers managing the aircraft as they depart to stay on the route until Candle. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's what was identified from the public.
Okay,
that's
so
what
this
we
is a
looked at. That's
controller.
exactly what we looked at.
Controller operated thing. So I want to go back to the night, the other approach we talked about earlier tonight.
Departure?
No, actually entry. Do the controllers not control which, I'm thinking the bodega approach into San Francisco, there's a west and an east leg approach. Can they not be directed to use the bay more frequently and you told me that it was the pilots that make that choice, but I thought it was a
No,
controller.
the pilots file the flight plan
They file the
plans for
flight
the
plans.
procedure that they're going to use.
I agree, but can't that, I'm under the impression that that can be overridden. And as a result, we could send more flights down the middle of the bay on the arrival to San Francisco.
How are you going to do that if it's congested?
Well, I'm asking you, I don't know. the
I don't
answer
know,
to
I didn't look at that.
that. Okay,
I looked at this.
yeah, no, I'm asking a,
Deep breaths all around, gentlemen.
Yeah. I don't know
Mr.
the
May?
answer to that.
Mr. May, seriously, just let's count to 10, take a deep breath. Short answer is, don't know today.
yeah.
Get
Maybe
back
we
to you
could
the
find
next
out
time.
tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
But I would like to have it looked at, because if we can move more of those incoming flights into San Francisco via the bay as opposed to over the peninsula, that would be a big, big help. And if it's a controller issued thing, then maybe we can issue directions there to make that happen. That was my point.
Got it. Before, Mr. May, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay. I'm
Good.
good.
Before we leave this item, folks, with your permission, I keep seeing Mayor Lewis here, who, if I remember correctly, serves on the SFO Roundtable as well as being an alternate to this body. And these last three items have been, I think, front and center at SFO. Mayor Lewis, do you want to make any comments or observations or questions? And if you do, could you come to the microphone so we could make sure it's available for public access? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you.
So the item that we were talking about going at the night departure and then out the gate, this is an item that the San Francisco Airport Roundtable is looking at in great detail, and Kathleen Wentworth reminded me and handed me a draft of what we're working on specifically in that response for that departure. So this body seems to be more concerned with arrivals, but if we can do the night departure and then when it comes turning left to come down the peninsula, to keep it out over the ocean as long as possible and higher before it comes into the peninsula, it will benefit all of our regions. So that's what we are working on. We will be submitting those comments to the FAA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. I think we are through item A1 and then item 3, 4, and 5. Anything else on those items, folks? All right, if not, then before we get to other solutions as identified by the committee, which is the opportunity for all of those pent-up solutions to come rushing forward, not because we're going to get them all resolved today, but just because we sort of want to create a to-do list for conversations going forward and to help give the FAA advance notice before our next meeting is what it's going to talk about. Might be time for a 5-minute break. So without objection, let's take a 5-minute break. And for those of you who are wondering, this is a 5-minute break that actually lasts 5 minutes. All right, we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Thank you all very much. could recall the committee members to their chairs so that people know that I can count to 5. All right, again, if members of the public could take their seats and we can call the committee members back. And we're working the technology here a little bit. Okay. And we're going to move on now to 1B, other solutions as identified by the committee. We can do some comments, some questions. Going to ask folks to try and keep these brief and just tee them up. I'm going to ask my staff, Ms. Zanardi, to try and make sure we capture as much of this as we can, but again, we'll have the benefit of the video, and I'm going to ask the FAA to try and capture as much of this as they can so that we can revisit these at subsequent meetings, but again, we'll have the benefit of the video, and as I say, less is more on this one, colleagues. We need enough to know what it is we're exploring or talking about at a subsequent meeting, but let's not try and design them all fully today, let alone explore them all. I'm going to start at this end of the dais just because it's been the quieter end of the dais today, and from that point forward. And so let's start. Mayor Lind.
Just a question.
Yes.
Did we miss Improve Aircraft 6?
No, we didn't.
Is that one of the ones we're waiting until the August meeting?
It is.
Okay.
And my staff assured me that if I didn't put a footnote there, somebody would ask that question. So they have now been proven right. So thank you on that one. All right. But we are going to go to 1B, other solutions as identified by the committee. All right. Anything on this side to start? All right. I think it was Mr. Leopold, actually, so I'm going to hand him the microphone. Mr. Leopold.
Well, one thing I just want to get clarity on from Mr. May, because when in our brief 5 minutes, I got 2 or 3 questions about people always see the planes going out over the water, and they say, hey, why do we even putting them over ground? Why don't we put them over the water? And I explained to them, but I'm just want to verify with you that when at our first meeting, we got information that there's restricted military airspace, which is why we don't use the Pacific Ocean as much or more than we could. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there is restricted airspace.
So that's the reason why when those
That's
flights...
one of the reasons.
Yeah. It goes out through the Golden Gate and it doesn't come down by the water. It's because there's some restricted airspace.
Correct.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's just start, and some of these have been raised before, but let's raise them again now officially on the record. So, Councilmember Bernal.
Officially on the record, retrofitting the Airbus.
Okay. Can we let's ask that we look at that at a subsequent meeting and that it's agendized and that we actually have some discussion about what would it take. And we have some suggestion or information in the materials we've received to date that the price would be a relatively modest $3,000 per aircraft. If so, doesn't seem cost prohibitive. What's the potential for making that happen and what kind of impact would it have? Other items, Ms. Bernal? No. Not for the moment. Okay. Mr. Waldeck.
Yeah, I passed out something to each of the members and to our FAA participants. It's this chart that I've seen recently. At our last meeting, we had an estimate by Mr. Martin that there was a relatively small percentage of Airbuses that are flying over. And that's this noise generator problem we're talking about again. It's got a whistle to it. It's a rather loud whistle. It's about 9 to 10 dB additional noise over and above the airframe itself. That's been measured. And we've also seen that you can get rid of most of that whistle by the addition of this vortex generator. Mr. Martin, I think was kind of shooting from the hip. No criticism here, but he says a relatively small percentage of Airbuses actually fly over. What this chart shows is that depending on where you are, it ranges from just under 23 all the way up to almost 40% of the aircraft overflying on the way into San Francisco are Airbuses. And they all have this whistle, and they all have a lot of extra noise. And so the question is, what would it take to issue an AD, airworthiness directive, to have these things installed? Or alternatively, is San Francisco Airport able to require such devices on such aircraft coming into their facility? That would be my question. Because that's the kind of thing we'd like to see, is that'll cut down an awful lot of noise just with a relatively simple and low-cost mod.
Okay. Other items? Yes, Mr. Lane.
Since I know we're being allowed to be just restating some past concerns.
Please
but
do.
I do want to do that. And that it's just a part of whatever that overlays many solutions, which is there a way to use a different way of measuring sound than is historically been used, that is more familiar to us as local elected officials, as in terms of not necessarily the sort of aggregate noise that is the model that seems to be used, but is really recognizes the peak noise levels. And because it seems like whatever we do, if we don't take that into account both in current situation and in proposed future modifications, we're not, the FAA may do something that we don't actually recognize as being a solution. So I'll stop there.
All right. Mr. Leopold.
Just a quick follow-up. It has been suggested about some pre and post noise monitoring, so we have some idea. Congresswoman Eshoo, I think, explained at our first meeting that trying to find some metrics that we could point to the community, because as the 12 of us sit up here and try to assimilate all the technical information necessary in order to give you a recommendation, she talked about the need for a clear set of metrics that we could share with the community, so whatever changes or recommendations that we made, people could see there was going to be a benefit. And so I'm not exactly sure what those are, but measuring sound before a procedure and after a procedure, and some ability, I guess as a second item, to have an ongoing technical discussion after the conclusion of the select committee's work to ensure that our best recommendations were not only met, but actually provided the relief that people are so desperately seeking. So I guess my two things are to look about the possibility of testing for some kind of sound testing both before any changes and then afterwards, and two is to have an ongoing technical forum that we can talk about whatever changes or recommendations are made.
Ms. Bernald.
There's one other thing, and I already did bring it up, but I want to qualify it. In the descent via, frequently the ATC is available to do accept, and some of those things are what are causing the noise and getting them off track. I'd like to have that discussed as whether it's absolutely necessary, or if we can have some influence on the ATC doing descent via accept.
Others? Mr. G.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just needed to represent this side of the dais. So,
Thank you.
I know Mr. Martin said in his earlier comments that dispersion is off the table, but I'd like to see if we can have a conversation about dispersion or artificial fanning, because if your home is the one underneath that GPS point, you're probably not going to be there very, very long. You're going to find a way to move. So we need to share the wealth, if you want to call it that. And I'd like to see if we can have a conversation about dispersion or artificial fanning, whatever the right technical term is on that. The other part is, I think the FAA has used the term not feasible in a number of the recommendations, but as we carry forward our conversation a little further, I would challenge the FAA to go beyond not feasible, because as we saw in the presentation last week, we have a congested airspace. There's no question about it. It's constrained, but what I would like to challenge the FAA to do is that you can say not feasible, on the other hand, feasible if, and what those constraints are, so that as elected officials, we might have the chance to say, well, it makes sense to move San Jose Airport 50 miles south, or whatever it might be, so that we really can understand the constraints that are really limiting you and your ability to develop procedures that are impactful to our community or less impactful. You know, whether it's advocating to reduce the, whatever that defense airspace is, or whatever it is that's in the way of your procedure design, I think it'd be helpful for us to know what those limitations are, and we can challenge our congressional elected officials. Can you do something about that? Can you make it smaller? Can you do something else so to give you more room to develop procedures that can help the region?
Staying on this side for a moment. Marilyn, your light is on. I don't know if that's from a prior comment. It is? Okay. Mr. Leopold.
One other thing, I wasn't, more ideas will come to me, but I just thought of another one that we need to talk about, and is the BRICS departure route and its interplay with all these pieces, because in the change of flight path from Big Sur to Surfer, it was also a lowering of the BRICS flight path, and the intersection of those for the people who are underneath that in the Santa Cruz Mountains is great. So for us to look about raising BRICS as part of all this, so it doesn't impact folks in the mountain as much, would be incredibly helpful for us to take a look at.
I'm going to weigh in at this point and mention, just looking at our today's agenda, the item that we didn't get to yet that Marilyn asked about earlier, item number 6 under A, is improve aircraft setup and sequencing between facilities. Now that's a conversation we're going to have at a subsequent meeting. I've come to the tentative conclusion now after these last few months that there is an awful lot of potential relief in that simple but perhaps difficult to implement sentence. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, because I think that's a place where if we can engage the folks at NorCal TRACON that you mentioned, and Oakland or Fremont, however we describe it, as well as local air traffic, that there may be some opportunities that are really more almost administrative. Perhaps that's not the right word, but that don't involve necessarily new procedures, but that simply involve saying, you know what, we're just not sequenced right. We need to think this through a little bit. I think there's some potential there. So even though it's to be determined, I want to highlight it today as a place where I think a lot of things that I might suggest end up falling in that bailiwick. I should mention, colleagues, that earlier I referenced the fact that we have a letter from the city of Palo Alto. The letter itself is, I think, just 3 pages. There are, of course, attachments, and I gather from the letter that there are attachments to come. That being said, there are 4 specific bullets, and I appreciate the fact that they're called out relatively crisply so that we can, and they are on page 2 of the July 7th letter. And I think the 4th one, which is ensure that the divisions and staff within FAA are working in partnership with each other to minimize noise through efficient organization of aircraft and utilizing arrival descents that limit brake speeds. I think that one, again, folds into item number 6 on our agenda today, and it's part of that larger discussion about, you know, if we just were able to be a little more rigorous about all this, we might see some benefit. That being said, the other 3 items are all specific requests / suggestions, and I do want us to take a look at them. I'll just read them out quickly because they're in writing and we have them. Item number 3, moving in reverse order now, shift the flights arriving from the north away from the peninsula to the bay. This is the teardrop that some people talk about, and it's what I call the reverse of the teardrop in terms of how folks come in. So I'd like to take a look at that. Redirect flights, this is number 2, arriving from the south to the east, away from the Pacific Ocean coast, to the mountains west of Interstate 5, and have aircraft enter the bay from the east. So instead of having folks who are coming from the south come south to north and end up making the approach over the Santa Cruz County coastline and or the peninsula, if those flights came up along the mountains that are between us and Highway 5 and then Honolulu when they got to the far enough point in the north, is that a possibility that would reduce noise as well? And then number 1, have the FAA create more points for aircraft to use while entering SFO. There's currently 1 point used for flights coming in from the north, west, or south. This point centralizes all aircraft and noise over Palo Alto. All due respect to Palo Alto, I think it centers noise over more than just Palo Alto. But I think the point here is that this suggestion is, I think, because I don't want to speak for the folks who made it, but we had some presentations where people talked about creating something like a herringbone pattern, meaning points of access to the flight path or procedure that did not all concentrate at one location, but that came in at various points along that path. This is a technical maneuver that I'm describing with my hand movements here, so hopefully it'll be captured on video if it looks like I'm swimming through rough waters. Anyway, if we could have 1, 2, and 3, and 4 for that matter, although I think 4 is probably captured in the information we've got. I should also mention that in that same letter, there is reference to, I'm looking at the 3rd paragraph on page 1, it says, in the process of analyzing the study for the select committee, our consultants learned that the FAA will also be amending a number of procedures at SFO on July 21, 2016, and September 5th, that would be yesterday, yes, and September 15, 2016. This will mean a significant increase in noise levels and negative impact for the region. We ask that the FAA address these changes in the coming select meetings in July. Could we just get a response back on that at our next meeting, please? I think that would be helpful, and then we'll go. Now,
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
With regards to item number 1A6, improve aircraft setup and sequencing between facilities, I would ask that you and the vice chairs consider inviting the airport directors from the 3 airports to attend this meeting, because they have a major role in that in terms of sequencing and working with the airlines, and it might be beneficial that they at least hear from this panel.
I am open to that. I want to suggest that that may or may not be, I'll sound like the FAA now, I'd like some more general direction, but that's not quite that specific. I do think we are at the point in the conversation where it would help to get the people who are technical and who actually are responsible for some of these operations to sit in the room with each other. So who that is, when and where that is, and in what forum to be determined. I'm not sure having the 12 of us sit there with them while they have that conversation is the most useful thing to do. But I do think it's time to engage them in being part of the solution, and I don't think that's going to happen with just one agency or entity represented. So I think the point's well taken. Before I go back to members of the committee, we also have, as I understand it, a resolution from the City of Menlo Park, and Mr. Otaki, who is an alternate to this committee, is here. And again, with the consent of the Select Committee, what I'd like to do is, sorry, Mr. G, is ask him to come up to the microphone so we can record this and speak briefly. And if there is a way to translate this into a somewhat more concise potential solution, feel free, Or alternatively, since I'm just seeing it now, and I think most of us are, if it's just we've got some concerns that you don't head off in this direction, let us know that. And Councilmember Wataki, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the committee, and also thank you to the FAA. Appreciate it. I will shortcut it by saying basically out of the 10 points that are in the resolution, 5 are observations and 5 are specific recommendations. So what I'd like to do to shortcut it is I will highlight which ones are the recommendations and as part of the further discussion. So if you look down on the first page, item number 3, which is the City Council request that the FAA reduce the arrivals into SFO using the Bodega West route over the peninsula and instead utilize the Bodega East route over the San Francisco Bay. I think that has been mentioned a few times. The concern we have, of course, is the U-turn that takes place as it comes down the peninsula. It does a U-turn over primarily Palo Alto, but in Menlo Park we get it twice. We get those flights twice because they're in one part and then they come around the Menlo Waypoint. There are approximately 100 flights per day on average, and so that's certainly been an issue. Related to that is item number 4, which is the second request, which is if, I do understand under congestion and the animation that was provided in the first meeting, that it's not often as easy to do that all the time as to shift it over to the east route. If the west route does have to be utilized, that it has a higher altitude before beginning the U-turn. What we have observed, this is not scientific, but what we've observed is that when the Menlo Waypoint has come down, which is a later point we'll talk about, the flights are coming down the peninsula on this Bodega West route, and they are at a lower altitude than they used to be, even before they come around the U-turn, which affects communities such as Woodside, Portola Valley, Menlo Park, Palo Alto, and Los Altos as it's coming down essentially over the 280 corridor before it makes the U-turn over Palo Alto and then comes back north to the Menlo Waypoint. So the altitude, and I'd probably add the dispersion is something we'd like to ask the FAA to evaluate. Items 5 and 6, well, 5 is simply related to is a statement that Representative Eshoo had originally worked with the FAA 15 years ago, in which during visual flight conditions, the minimum altitude over the Menlo Waypoint would be 5,000 feet or higher, and under essentially marine layer, foggy conditions, the altitude would be 4,000 feet for safety purposes, which is understandable. The point that we request, which is item number 6, is that we understand now, and I think that's the footnote to the changes that are being made in Palo Alto's letter on July 21st, is that now there's a mandatory altitude over the Menlo Waypoint, regardless of the weather conditions of 4,000 feet. That is demonstrated in some of the altitude statistics that have been gathered by Sky Posse Los Altos. And so our request, therefore, is number 6, that the FAA consider increasing the minimum altitude during visual flight conditions, much like that original compromise reached by Representative Eshoo and the FAA. Finally, number 8 is the final request that is along the lines of, I think, Councilmember Waldeck of Los Altos Hills has mentioned that essentially we have right now a concentration of the routes over the Menlo Waypoint. We'd like to see if there's a way to disperse those over other potential waypoints. I think Mr. Waldeck had mentioned Rockme, which is at 4,000 feet. It's roughly over the Dumbarton Bridge. There's even one of our residents who has suggested the Faith Waypoint, which is way over at the start of the ILS, even over San Jose. I did hear, Mr. May, that you mentioned one of the concerns with Rockme, for example, is possible conflict within a mile of the San Jose Moffett airspace, which I do appreciate. And related to that is the question of whether that airspace still includes Moffett Field, which is largely not operational. And if it's not operational, does it make sense to reduce that particular part of the airspace, which would actually allow the use of Rockme and still have a 1.5 mile buffer? So I don't want to get too technical, but that's just simply a suggestion to look at out of the box possibility of that alternate waypoint. So those are the points. Thank you.
And Mr. Otake, just to make sure, I've identified 3, 4, 6, 8, and 10 as the actual asks.
Yes, that's right. I forgot to mention 10 would be a follow-on committee on
and I'm going to speak to that in just a minute, so I'll do that work for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to your council colleagues for taking the time to address the issue. Colleagues, on item number 10 on the Menlo Park list is one that I have on my list as well, which is we have had some conversation about what happens after November, and given that these issues are not going to be fully resolved, and even to the extent we think we've got them resolved, they're going to require some ongoing check-in, monitoring, so on and so forth, what vehicle, if any, exists. So I think this may be an issue more for our discussion, frankly, than the FAA, but I certainly welcome the FAA's participation in identifying the kind of forum that would be useful in making sure that, in the months and years ahead, we have a way to communicate more effectively and to avoid the kind of upset that took place this time with NextGen. So whether that's SFO roundtable-like or something very different, or I don't presume to know at this point, but I think we need to have that conversation as part of the longer-term set of issues. The other, and it's an issue that's come up occasionally that I'd like to add to the list, colleagues, is the issue of the descent profile. And there's been some suggestion made by some of our community noise groups that we might be able to, and I think this in some ways touches on some of the issues that Councilmember Waldeck raised earlier, that with a steeper descent, we might be able to start higher and stay higher rather than be so low, so long over populated areas. And, I know that that's got some issues, but, what we're being told by some of our folks in the community noise groups is they make it work in other parts of the world. Is there a reason we couldn't make it work here? So if we could take a look at that issue as well, either because it's an opportunity that we ought to take advantage of, or because if it can't be done, we should say, here's why it can't be done, or if it falls into the category of things that Mr. G was talking about, which is, well, might not work right now, but if we spend the next 3 years lobbying somebody, we can get it done. That would be good to know as well. So the descent issue, descent profiles. Other issues, I'm going to go down the row and just make sure I haven't left anybody out. Mr. Moody, okay for today? Ms. Lind? All right. Mr. Mayor, Butler, okay? Ms. Wenger?
I just want to follow on a couple of things that Peter Otake just referenced, because certainly they're ones that I think we've touched on, but I want to amplify one or two of them if I could. And first of all, there will be a report coming, just to let this group know, it's a combined report of Los Altos Hills, Woodside, and Portola Valley. It'll be distributed probably early next week to this committee, and we'll have a number of similar points as were just, I think, illuminated by Peter. But I think 2 or 3 things stand out in my mind that I want to just mention today relative to what we'll be seeing. And one of them is the suggestion, and I think we've heard this on multiple fronts, of potentially moving to the southeast, and again, this is something Peter referenced, possible things as well as Gary, the Menlo Waypoint, so that there would be obviously a much greater use of potentially the water and the space surrounding it for that very, very busy waypoint, recognizing it's an integral part of the whole NextGen system. And I think an overall concern that there could be, in fact, some minor tweaks to altitudes at in a number of these procedures and in a number of the routes that we've all been discussing. I know we're going to touch Surfer, Big Sur in the next discussion, but there's an overall concern on our part that there's been altitude creep downward over many years, both in the vectoring as well as the procedures, and that if there is some way to encourage the FAA to take that spider's web that we know we're dealing with of the convergence of the routes and potentially consider ways in which they could help all of the communities in the region by, in some fashion, looking at a solution that could help in that regard. Because we know that with the increased traffic and all of the issues related to the OPD, with the steeper descent and therefore some noise associated with that, that it is not going to get better, it's going to get worse, just in terms of the numbers of aircraft flying into the area. And finally, the other thing I would mention as a point is that there are a number of what I'll call legacy agreements that Peter referenced, one on the Medlow Waypoint with the 5,000 minimum under visual conditions. And certainly for us, the Woodside VOR and oceanic arrivals has been one that was heavily negotiated a number of years ago with, again, the congressional representatives getting agreement to maintain a minimum altitude of 8,000. And that has clearly deteriorated significantly over time. And we have the noise measurements to prove that and the altitude measurements to show that as well. So to the extent that any agreements that had previously been utilized prior to next gen be restored at a minimum, I think that is something that we would ask the FAA to take a look at this juncture as well.
All right. I think, Ms. Weingart, what I'm going to suggest is that we consider each of those items, one of the items on our quote to-do list here in terms of assessing potential solutions. I'm going to ask that when we have the document at our next meeting, that we actually set aside time to sort of call those out formally into the record when we have paper in front of us. We'll get the paper to the FAA sooner rather than later, but I do think we want to get started on those issues as soon as we can and add them to the list of what about this and what about that. Okay?
Thank you.
Mr. G, we okay?
I'm fine, thank you.
Mr. Leopold?
Just to follow up on an earlier comment made by Councilmember G, when we have that discussion about the improving aircraft setup and sequencing, I think it would be helpful not to have the airports participate in the discussion with the 12 of us, but for them to have representative here to know what we are talking about. So when they have that discussion, it isn't just that they got a piece of paper and they said, here's these 6 things, but they can actually get the feelings from the 12 representatives up here. I think that would be useful.
Ms. Bernal?
Again, to clarify, since it has been brought up about tweaking the height, raising EPIC to 10,000 feet.
All right.
Well, to make sure, to move more towards the 10,000 foot level, if possible. Again, raising it so it doesn't continue to creep down.
Then, Mr. Adiego, we're good? Mr. Waldeck? Got it. Mr. Hindi? All right. Mr. Lane? All right. Just a couple more brief announcements. Wanted to let the committee know and the public. As we've had these conversations, we've gotten some expressions of concern. Some of you will remember that we had a couple of council members from Sunnyvale who spoke when we were at our public hearing in Mountain View on what I would call 2 different but obviously related issues. One has to do with the issue of surf air, and I was happily able to tell folks that that was not within the purview of this committee, and that this was an issue that was being wrestled with by the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, among others, but there's a concern on the part of some folks in the area that I would describe as the South Bay, including Sunnyvale and Mountain View, that any of the potential changes that are actually in the works even as we speak with respect to surf air had the potential to affect those communities. So I will be writing a letter in my individual capacity as a supervisor to the FAA. I've mentioned this to Mr. Martin, so he's not surprised that it's coming, just to suggest that they be in touch there, and I'm trying to keep those issues candidly out of this committee because I don't think they're well dealt with here. The other is a concern, and again, I think some of this was referenced at the hearing we had in Mountain View, by the same communities, that some of the solutions we talk about here have the potential to impact those communities. I think there may just be some misunderstanding, but I just wanted to let you all know I've shared those concerns with the FAA. They understand that as we're talking about issues that affect the 3 congressional districts, that we want to be mindful of the fact that there are other communities that may not necessarily be here at the table by virtue of representation, and we obviously want to treat them fairly as well. So just everything's connected to everything, and that's the obvious observation about those 2 things. Our next meetings are as scheduled. We have the handout. Again, they will be in this place. They will be Thursdays. They will be 1 to 4 to try and help with traffic. And last call on any procedural issues or questions going forward. Mr. May, you and your team, all good for the day?
We're good, thank you.
All right, and let me just say again? You want me to read the dates into the record? All right. I will read. I'm taking the adult supervision from my office. So I'm going to ask somebody to hand me that sheet so that I can say that our next meetings of the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals will be from 1 to 4 at Palo Alto City Hall on August the 4th, August 18th, September 1st, September 29th, October 13th, October 27th, and November 17th. Again, all of these are Thursdays. And I just want to be very clear, actually, with the community about this, so if we can get just a bit of a hush for a moment. There is no guarantee that this is a timeline that this committee can or will meet. This is a proposed timeline. It is our hope that we can work our way through all this on this timeline. But we may discover we have need for additional time and or additional meetings. So I don't want folks to go out there feeling like this is etched in stone. It is our best effort as of today to lay out a timeline that we can work with for the committee, the FAA, and the community. That being said, my thanks to everyone who was here today. Thank you to the committee members. Thank you to the FAA. Thanks again to our host, the Palo Alto, City of Palo Alto, and thank you to all the community members who've been so diligent about your participation and attendance as well. We are adjourned.